Everyone knows King Henry VIII as the man who changed the world for a son. He broke his marriage, he broke his church, he broke his soul, all in the desperate pursuit of a legitimate heir. We picture him as the king tormented by his wife's failures to give him a living boy. The man who blamed God, defied the Pope, and rewrote the laws of England for one purpose: to have a son who could inherit his throne. But what if I told you that Henry VIII already had that son? That before Anne Boleyn, before the Reformation, before the blood and the chaos, Henry held in his arms the perfect answer to his obsession: a strong, healthy boy, a prince in everything but name. And yet, when that boy died, the king ordered him buried in silence. No royal procession, no grand tomb, and the boy's mother, the woman who had given him what no queen could, was forbidden even to attend her son's funeral. This is not the story of the Tudors you were taught. This is the story of Henry FitzRoy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate son, born in triumph, raised in power, and erased in death. Today on Hidden Crowns, we're going to open the coffin history sealed shut, to uncover why the son Henry should have loved most was buried like a secret. Was it plague, politics, or punishment? Why did the man who defied heaven for a son choose to hide the one son he already had? By the end of this story, you might see the Tudors' greatest tragedy not as Anne Boleyn's fall, but as the forgotten boy the king was too afraid to mourn. Before we begin, remember to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, because the truth about history's loudest kings is often whispered through the stories of the ones they tried to silence. Let's start with the moment everything shifted. Not in a chapel, not on a battlefield, but in a bedroom. In 1519, while Queen Catherine of Aragon grieved another stillborn child, a woman named Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The father was the King of England. Bessie had served as one of Queen Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, young, intelligent, and irresistibly fresh-faced. She was admired for her grace and her modesty, and perhaps that modesty was what first drew Henry's eye. Unlike the fiery mistresses of legend, Bessie was quiet. She wasn't ambitious. She wasn't dangerous. And that made her safe, until she wasn't. Imagine the atmosphere at court in those months. Catherine's pregnancies ended in heartbreak. Whispers coiled through the corridors about God's judgment. And behind closed doors, a king who loved to be adored was beginning to suspect that heaven itself was laughing at him. Then word spread, cautiously at first, then with gathering force, that one of the queen's ladies was carrying the king's child, and that this time the baby was not blue, not silent, not dead. He was alive. He was strong. He was male. Their affair had lasted several years. At first, it was whispered about, but not condemned. Even Queen Catherine seemed to turn a blind eye. Mistresses were part of the royal machinery, a way to keep the king satisfied without challenging the queen's authority. But everything changed when Bessie did something no mistress had ever done before. She gave birth to a living son. That single event, the birth of Henry FitzRoy, shattered the delicate balance of the Tudor court. Because in a world obsessed with legitimacy and lineage, a living son, any son, was proof that the problem wasn't Henry, it was Catherine. The king's pride erupted like fire. He didn't hide the boy, he flaunted him. For once, Henry VIII was not a man tormented by failure. He was a triumphant father. The boy was named Henry FitzRoy, literally Henry, son of the king. And unlike most royal bastards, he wasn't tucked away in shame. He was publicly acknowledged, baptized with noble sponsors, and given a household fit for a prince. From the outset, his world was built like a miniature kingdom. He had nurses, tutors, servants, lands assigned for his upkeep. Courtiers bowed to him. Ambassadors wrote home about him. He moved through palaces not as a shameful secret, but as a living symbol of the king's virility. The king showered him with titles: Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Earl of Nottingham, and later Lord Admiral of England. At just 6 years old, FitzRoy was made the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a role far beyond his years, but rich in symbolism. No one believed a child was really ruling Ireland, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Henry could lift his son before the eyes of the realm and say, "Look, God has given me a boy." The message was clear. This was not a mistake to be hidden. This was a boy meant for greatness. And somewhere, quietly, a queen in exile inside her own marriage must have heard the celebrations and realized that her failure had just been carved into flesh. For a brief moment, Bessie Blount was the most envied woman in England. She had given the king what no queen could, a healthy son. Her triumph was Henry's vindication. But in the twisted logic of the Tudor court, the very thing that made her valuable also made her disposable. Once FitzRoy was safely born and acknowledged, Bessie's purpose was complete. Henry arranged a respectable marriage for her to Gilbert Talboys, a Lincolnshire gentleman. It was a generous match, but make no mistake, it was also an exile. Bessie was sent away from court, her name gently erased from the gossip that once glorified it. She would never again stand in Henry's presence as a lover. Think about how cruelly transactional that is. The same body that had just proved the king's power was now an embarrassment, a reminder that the most precious child in England had been born in someone else's bed. It's one of the Tudor era's darkest ironies. The woman who proved the king could father a son was rewarded with quiet banishment. Henry adored his boy, but he had no intention of keeping the boy's mother around to remind him how that child had come into being. To keep Bessie at court would have meant living every day with visible proof of adultery, proof that Catherine, the pious Spanish queen, could have thrown back in his face. So Bessie was removed, carefully and politely, the way you move a piece off the chessboard once it has served its purpose. And so, while the king watched his son grow into the image of his father, Bessie Blount, the mother of the Duke of Richmond, faded from history's spotlight. She remarried, she lived quietly, and she waited. Waited for news from court. Waited for letters that rarely came. Waited for rumors about her son's health, his titles, his favor with the king. Waited for the day she might see him again. That day would never come. There are no recorded reunions, no emotional letters, no scenes of a mother embracing the boy she bore in such dangerous circumstances. There is only absence, the silence where her story should be. By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII's desperation for a legitimate male heir had reached fever pitch. Queen Catherine was past childbearing age. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Princess Mary. Henry's dynasty, the Tudor line, was barely 30 years old, and he feared it could end with him. But there was one person who proved it didn't have to: Henry FitzRoy. The boy grew into his father's image, tall, fair, strong, and precociously intelligent. Ambassadors described him as very handsome and of great promise. Henry adored him, lavishing him with tutors, attendants, and palaces. Courtiers noticed that when FitzRoy entered a room, people watched him the way they watched the king, measuring his gestures, his posture, his confidence, asking themselves the forbidden question: could this be our future? And though FitzRoy was illegitimate, the king began to wonder, could he be made legitimate? Could he, one day, be king? It wasn't an impossible idea. There were precedents. Kings had legitimized bastards before, most famously William the Conqueror himself. And in 1527, Henry took a step no one expected. He petitioned the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Publicly, he claimed it was because the marriage had broken God's law. Privately, many suspected it was because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. But beneath both reasons was another, quieter one: the presence of Henry FitzRoy. If the Pope refused to recognize a new marriage and a new heir, Henry could legitimize the son he already had. FitzRoy was young but brilliant, and the English nobility admired him. The boy was even briefly considered as a possible match for the King of Scotland's daughter, a potential dynastic bombshell. Imagine it, a Tudor prince ruling England, married into the Scottish line, binding two thrones together a century before James VI and I. For a time, it seemed entirely possible that Henry FitzRoy might become the future King of England. But fate and Henry's own choices had other plans. Because as Anne Boleyn's influence grew, FitzRoy's future shrank. Anne wanted sons of her own, sons who owed nothing to another woman, sons who would not remind her husband and her enemies that the first boy had come from a nameless lady of the Queen's chamber. Step by step, decision by decision, Henry turned away from the solid child in front of him toward the fragile dream of a son who did not yet exist. In 1533, Henry's new marriage to Anne Boleyn sent shockwaves through Europe. Catherine was exiled. England broke with Rome. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, not the son Henry had hoped for. And in the midst of this chaos, Henry FitzRoy, then a teenager, began to fade from the king's attention. He was still loved, still honored, but no longer central to the grand plan. Anne wanted her own children to inherit, and the king, blinded by passion and politics, shifted focus from his living son to the unborn sons he still hoped for. FitzRoy's role became more symbolic than real. He remained Duke of Richmond, a glittering youth moving between estates, but he was no longer the emergency solution to the succession crisis. He was a spare, and a dangerous one. Because as long as he lived, there would always be those who whispered that he, not Anne's future boy, not anyone else, was the truest embodiment of Henry's strength. But nature and disease had their own script to write. In the summer of 1536, the same year Anne Boleyn was executed, Henry FitzRoy fell gravely ill. He was just 17 years old. The symptoms came suddenly: fever, coughing, exhaustion, and a wasting weakness. Some accounts speak of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Others whisper of plague, or the deadly sweating sickness that haunted Tudor England. Whatever it was, it moved fast. One day he was riding, hunting, laughing with companions. The next, he was confined to his bed, his body betraying the royal image the court had admired for years. Within weeks, the boy who had been the king's pride was dead. Henry FitzRoy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, the only son Henry VIII had ever acknowledged, was gone. The king's reaction shocked everyone. He did not proclaim national mourning. He did not order a grand funeral. He did not even allow the boy's mother to attend. Instead of a father torn open by grief, the court saw a king who closed in on himself, as if acknowledging this loss too loudly might crack the facade he'd built around his destiny. When news of FitzRoy's death reached the court, Bessie Blount was not there. She was living quietly with her second husband in the countryside. She begged to be allowed to attend the funeral. Henry refused. Instead, he ordered that his son be buried quickly and quietly in Thetford Priory, far from London, without the pomp or ceremony that usually marked a prince's passing. No royal heralds, no gilded coffin, no procession through the streets, no black-draped horses, no nobles in ordered ranks, no banners bearing the royal arms slowly lowered into the graveyard mist. Even the announcement of FitzRoy's death was subdued, more rumor than proclamation. It was as though the king wanted England to forget that the boy had ever existed. Why? Was it grief, the unbearable kind that demands silence? Was Henry too shattered, too frightened to watch a miniature version of himself lowered into the ground? Or was it fear? Because in 1536, Henry's throne was still uncertain. His new queen, Jane Seymour, was pregnant. His legitimacy crisis had divided the country. And a royal bastard buried with full honors might have reignited dangerous questions. What if some faction, some noble house, had rallied around the dead boy's memory? What if FitzRoy became a martyr in death, a rallying point for rebels who saw him as the true heir to a king who had twisted church and crown beyond recognition? Henry FitzRoy had once been a symbol of royal vitality. Now he was a symbol of royal vulnerability. To mourn him too publicly would be to admit that the Tudor dream of a secure male heir had died with him. So the king chose secrecy over sorrow. FitzRoy's coffin was carried at night, his burial conducted with minimal witnesses. It was said that his name was barely mentioned afterward, and when Thetford Priory was later dissolved, his remains were quietly moved to Framlingham Church, where he still lies, in a tomb as modest as his short life was grand. No life-sized effigy in armor, no Latin inscription shouting his titles to the ceiling, just stone, dust, and the echo of what might have been. For Bessie Blount, the silence was a second death. The boy she had borne in triumph, who had once been the proof of her king's love, was gone, and she was forbidden to grieve him publicly. She was not invited to court. No portrait of her son was ever commissioned. No memorial plaque named her as his mother. She faded into history's margins, a woman erased from her own child's story. We have no record of her words, but we can imagine the questions that must have tormented her. Did he suffer? Did he think of her? Was there anyone at his bedside who spoke her name? Or was she shut out even from his final thoughts? And yet, in the few scraps of record we have, you can still sense her shadow. A will here, a mention there, signs that she remained quietly proud, quietly heartbroken. She lived long enough to see Henry's later wives come and go, to see the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, and the brief life of Jane Seymour's son, Edward VI, the legitimate prince Henry had sacrificed so much to obtain. And perhaps she saw, with bitter clarity, that legitimacy is no protection from fate. Edward VI, the legitimate heir, died at 15, even younger than her own boy. Henry had broken the world for a lawful son, and in the end, both his sons, the bastard and the anointed, died before him. 2 boys, 2 different mothers, the same grave ending. What does legitimacy matter when the earth closes over them just the same? So, what do we make of Henry's silence? Why did a man who spent his life demanding recognition choose secrecy when it came to his own son's death? Maybe it was superstition, a belief that FitzRoy's death was a divine punishment for Henry's sins against Catherine of Aragon. Maybe it was politics, the need to maintain the illusion that his new marriage, his new religion, his new world order were still divinely favored. Or maybe, just maybe, it was guilt. Because Henry had created a world where love was conditional, where loyalty was measured in bloodlines, and where even a son who bore his face and name could not be safely remembered. To mourn FitzRoy would have meant confronting the truth, that the perfect heir he had always wanted was the one he had never been allowed to keep. It would mean admitting, even to himself, that he had spent years tearing his kingdom apart for something he already possessed and had casually sidelined. And so, instead, he turned away. He buried his son. He buried his grief. And he buried the memory. Like so many of Henry's mistakes, FitzRoy became something he refused to look at. Another ghost drifting in the corridors of palaces where portraits only showed the victories, never the losses. Today, Henry FitzRoy's tomb still lies in Framlingham Church, unmarked by royal emblems, overshadowed by the monuments of others. Most visitors pass by without realizing they are standing beside the body of the king's first son, the boy who might have changed English history forever. Because imagine, for a moment, if FitzRoy had lived. If Henry had legitimized him, if the Reformation had been avoided, if England had never broken with Rome. There might have been no Anne Boleyn, no Elizabeth I, no bloody wars of religion. Or perhaps those things would still have come, but under a king shaped by different traumas, guided by a son he had learned to protect instead of sacrifice. All of Tudor history might have turned on its head if one 17-year-old boy had simply lived another year. Instead, his life ended as it had begun, in contradiction. He was the king's pride and his shame, the heir and the illegitimate, the proof of divine favor and the embodiment of sin. No wonder Henry buried him in silence, because to speak FitzRoy's name aloud was to admit that the greatest gamble of Henry's reign, the break with Rome, the blood, the wives, the ruined lives, might have been unnecessary. There's something haunting about Bessie Blount's story. She didn't fight for power. She didn't seek titles. She didn't demand recognition. All she wanted was her child. And yet, in the world she lived in, a mother's love was never enough to earn her a place at her own son's grave. It's easy to see the Tudor era as a stage of crowns and executions, but beneath that spectacle were human hearts, women who bled and grieved, men who feared their own mortality so deeply they destroyed everyone who reminded them of it. Henry VIII is remembered as the king who wanted a son, but maybe he's better understood as the man who couldn't bear to lose one and couldn't bear to face the pain when he did. We like to imagine power makes people bigger than their pain, but in Henry's case, it did the opposite. The more power he had, the less capable he became of admitting weakness. And what is grief, if not the loudest confession of weakness there is? So he silenced it. He silenced Bessie. He silenced FitzRoy. He silenced the story. But grief doesn't vanish just because a king refuses to speak it. It lingers in empty tombs, in missing names, in the way history hesitates when it reaches this part of the tale. So what really killed Henry FitzRoy? Was it tuberculosis, as physicians claimed? Or plague, the sweating sickness that decimated Tudor England? Or was there something more mysterious? We will never know for sure. The records are too thin, the diagnoses too vague, the truth too carefully wrapped in royal silence. But what's clear is this. Henry's reaction tells us everything about his fear, not just of death, but of weakness, of failure, of being seen as less than the king he pretended to be. He hid his son's death the way he hid his regrets, under layers of ceremony, denial, and silence. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It only waits, centuries later, for someone to tell it again. So now I'll ask you, what do you think was the real reason Henry FitzRoy was buried in secrecy? Was it plague, politics, or guilt? And what kind of man forbids a mother from saying goodbye to her son? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, because history's loudest kings often left their darkest secrets in the quietest graves. This is Hidden Crowns, where the voices buried by power finally speak.